Good evening, everybody. My name's Stephanie Perry and I'm the Mayor at Monash. I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's event. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and paying my respects to their elders past, present and future. I'd also like to acknowledge my fellow councillors who are joining me here tonight. Councillor Rebecca Patterson, Deputy Mayor and Mount Waverley Ward Councillor. We have Councillor Jeff Lake from Glen Waverley Ward, Councillor Bill Ponticus from the Oakley Ward, Councillor Jae Yung Loh from the Mount Waverley Ward and Councillor Robert Davies from the Mulgrave Ward. And I thank each and every one of you for coming out tonight. For those who came to our previous forums on this matter, you will notice that we have made some logistical improvements tonight so that everyone can hear and see the discussion that's happening this evening. Tonight is about Council responding to the 10 questions which received the most votes on the Our Say online forum. Our Director of City Development, Peter Panagakos, and his team will be providing answers to the questions. And us councillors will be listening very closely to the discussion. All of the feedback and discussion is very helpful for councillors to hear, as we haven't yet made up our minds on whether we will go ahead with these changes. We may decide to go ahead with all of the changes, or some of the changes, or indeed none of the changes. After tonight's forum, we'll be giving the matter more consideration over the next few weeks. At our next council meeting on the 29th of March, we'll be considering a report on all of the community feedback that we have received via the online forum, the in-person forums, the phone calls, the letters and the emails. At that meeting, we will then reach an in-principle position on whether we proceed with all, some or none of the changes. We will then seek community feedback on our in-principle position before making a final decision at our meeting in late May. It's been a very long consultation period, having started in the middle of last year, so we thank you very much for your patience and for your continued involvement throughout the process. The consultation has been long and thorough because it is very important to us that everyone gets a say on this issue. Our homes are the largest investments that many of us tend to make in our lifetimes, so it makes sense that people care a lot about the rules that impact on their homes, whether they see these rules as positive or negative or something in between. So thank you once again very much for your involvement. I'm now going to hand over to A.L. Halamish from Our Say, and he will facilitate tonight's discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Hello everyone, and thank you again for coming tonight, and thank you for the introduction and for councillors for joining us tonight for the engagement. My name, as mentioned, is Eyal Halamish, and I run rsay.org. RSay is a digital and offline engagement company that helps citizens and councils see eye to eye on really complex policy decisions. And so tonight is really about bringing up citizens' voices, citizens' questions, citizens' concerns, and making sure we're getting information from council about those concerns and those questions, and then ensuring that those insights are informing the council decision that Stephanie just alluded to in her presentation. I want to run through the agenda for tonight and then get straight into the questions. But first off, we've done the welcome and we're going to go through the agenda. As part of the agenda, we want to go through some ground rules for tonight, which we've preloaded based on our previous engagements. We're then going to speak a little bit about the proposed amendment, where we are at now, and the process for making a decision about this. I'll also explain the consultation that's been organized to date and how we arrived at the 10 most voted for questions and some of the data behind who's actually participated in the online forum to date. We'll then turn it over to the 10 authors. Some are here tonight to ask their questions in present, and some have asked me to ask their question on their behalf. And some questions have been combined if they're similar questions so that we're using our time as wisely as possible. After that, we'll actually turn to a few more questions that came through the online process that if we've got more time, and then we'll also turn it over to the floor. If you've got questions, we've got roaming mics, and we've got cameras to capture the people who want to ask questions here tonight. And if we don't get through all those questions, we've also got some planners on hand at the front, and if you're in the rooms upstairs, also in those different rooms where you can actually turn to those planners if you've got specific questions about your residential properties or the zone's impact or the changes that are to be made. We're not looking for pre-application questions here. It's just about any better understanding the changes that are being proposed. Once we've turned over to the planners in that format, we'll wrap up at around 9 o'clock. So let's go to the ground rules. So first off, we're going to keep to time tonight, so I'm going to keep the things moving as much as possible. And if I feel there's a mood that people want to hear a few more questions or stick to a few more, I'll extend it out a little bit. Also, mobile phones off or switch to silent. If everyone can just quickly turn off their mobile phones. I heard one go off just before. Hopefully that wasn't one of the guys in the front. Was that you, Alex? And we're going to be respecting different viewpoints. As we've seen in the online forum and also in this room, there are people who have very different viewpoints around this policy matter. Planning policy always strides right down the middle, and there's always complexity when you go down making these decisions. And so we need to be very respectful of the fact that we're making decisions on behalf of a community, not just based on individuals. And finally, it's about being civil, so making sure that we're civil with the content that comes through. As I mentioned, first off, we're going to be responding to the top 10 questions that came in online to give some context, and a lot of people supported those questions. So why are we here? At a very high level, just next slide. At a very high level, it's been said that by state government that 1.6 million additional dwellings are required in and around Melbourne in the coming years. And that means that there's going to be growth zones happening around the inner parts of Melbourne. And so the proposed amendment C125 is actually a response to that, about how do we actually maintain the garden character of this city, but also enable it so that people can develop or actually do what they'd like to do with their properties. And it's a fine line that's being tread here, and that's what we're going to be discussing tonight. And our planners who are up here at the front will also allude to more insights around that as we go through the questions. And the decision-making process. So to explain to you where we are in the decision-making process, next slide, is, as Stephanie mentioned, it's been a long consultation process because we know this proposed amendment runs deep in this community. And so we've done workshops and consultation last year in 2015, where there was about 15 consultations run across the city. This year, we started off the year with a month long of online and offline consultations. So we sent a brochure and a letter to every single household in the city. We also notified them that they can submit their questions online, and those questions would be responded to. And that the top 10 questions would be responded to here tonight, as well as any additional questions that came through. Tonight, we're going to have those responses and other questions. Then that's going to be informing council, who's sitting here listening to your questions, who's going to make a preliminary decision on March 29th. So that's just a draft council position before we go to another formal consultation process in April and May. And then a final decision is to be made on May 31st. So very briefly, turning into the online platform and where these questions came from. The 10 most voted for questions, so in the span of the month that it was live, we had nearly 7,000 unique visitors, and if you spread that across, that represents about 10% of households in the community, if you took that number. Also, the different age groups involved, we had about 46% were between the ages of 41 and 60, about 30% were 60 plus, 25% were 26 to 40, and 2% were under the age of 25. And we also had representation across the entire city from Oakley, Clayton, Wheelers Hill, Mount Waverley, Glen Waverley, Hughesdale, and we really got a good spread there. Well, that's enough about the background about it, but let's turn over to the questions so we spend as much time as possible on that. So what I want to do is I'm going to invite the first question asker up, and I've also got him, his question listed in the documents that you have in front of you. So you would have a couple of documents. One of them says the 10 most voted for questions, and Rama's question is on there, along with Venkat's question. Rama's going to ask his question. Council will have a chance to provide some information about that question. Rama will actually get a chance to ask a follow-up question. They'll have a chance to respond as well. And then I'll also read elements of Venkat's question, which haven't been addressed in Rama's question, to make sure we're getting as much as possible here. Rama, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, council officers and councillors, for this opportunity. I assert that the C125 does not strike the correct balance between the need for garden city character and increased requirements for housing capacity in Melbourne by 2051. There are already 34 design guidelines governing construction of units and townhouses. We don't need more. My key concerns. 1, the C125 will significantly reduce land available for building appropriately sized family accommodation. This is not acceptable. C125 will significantly reduce housing diversity, affordability, and will increase housing stress. I elaborate. As C125 restricts dwelling sizes, instead of building dog box-like units and townhouses, residents are more likely to build single large dwellings. This will reduce the number of units and townhouses across Monash for families and reduce housing diversity. Since many families can't afford to buy single large dwellings, nor can they live comfortably in smaller dwellings, it will directly impact housing affordability, and increase housing stress. Third point, C125 will result in single garages and increased street congestion. Several of the proposed townhouses for block sizes 700 square meters and under seem to have single garages instead of double garages possible under the current rules. This will only increase street congestion and resident frustration. Point 4, C125 will impact aging in place. This is a major concern for many of us. Parents can't build sufficiently sized dwellings to have their children next door so that they can provide care and support during the later years in life, and vice versa. Children can't build houses for parents either. If council is going ahead with this decision, I request the council to consider the following. Increase rear setback to only 2 meters instead of the proposed 5 meters. Leave private open space at current 35 square meters single parcel instead of 60 square meters. Leave side setback as per current and rest of the permeability rules and others. This will allow families to build suitable units and townhouses, and 35 square meters is sufficient enough for children to run around without overburdening the elderly in too much backyard maintenance. One canopy tree to be planted in the front yard of 6 meters maximum height instead of 10 meters high. 10 meters high canopy trees are too large and dangerous within the residential blocks. We have lived in experience, and the photographs would be shown from our house when the trees have fallen in the subsequent questions. They also reduce the ability to have a veggie patch or capture solar energy. Also, council must take ownership of the maintaining of garden city character by planting large canopy trees on the nature strips like the city of Burundura, not dump its responsibility on the residents. Not acceptable. Growth zones around railway stations. I'm surprised and staggered that the growth zones around railway stations has not been considered. So I suggest reclassify around railway stations, Sindal, Mount Waverley, etc., say within 800 meters radius or 10 minutes walking distance as growth zones, and encourage high density development.
Thank you, Rama. And as is noted in there, yeah, just by a quick show of hands, how many people in the audience think this is an important question for them? Great, thank you. So we've got a fair people in the audience who support this question. I did receive 708 votes online. And I'll also, with the canopy trees, there's a photo and there's a question later that talks about canopy trees in particular. And so we'll present those photos as well. But I want to hand over to Council Peter. Did you want to take this one?
I do. Thank you, Ayal. And Rama, thank you for your question. I know you've spent a lot of time and effort trying to understand the requirements and have been an active participator, and we thank you. We thank you for that. To start, there's a lot of questions that you've gone through and that you've posed. I feel it's important to perhaps correct a couple of things in terms of the way that we see the controls working. Namely that houses and units, some of those will change, and some of the houses and units that we're seeing being constructed today may get smaller as a result of the controls. They're certainly not dog box-like type units that you'll be able to construct on the available piece of land that is remaining if you met these requirements. The question or the comment about single garages, the drawings that were shown on the RSA website were illustrating a comparison between existing developments that have been proposed and how they might be transformed as a result of the regulations for illustrative purposes. Some of those did show single garages. What doesn't change with regards to these controls is that every dwelling that has 3 or more bedrooms is required to provide 2 car parking spaces on the site. Whether they do that in the form of a double garage or whether they do that in the form of a single garage with a tandem space, they are required and will be still required to provide that rate of car parking. That doesn't change. Our experience tells us that there is still an ability to fit a decent size or 2 decent sized townhouses on most regular allotments and provide a double garage as we do today. And we've got an image that illustrates that that we'll put up in a moment of an actual development that generally meets the requirements. And what we see is 2 double-storey units that meet the 5 metre rear setback, that provide the 60 square metres of open space, that have double garaging attached to them. on a standard 725 odd square metre allotment, which is the typical lot size allotment that we have in the municipality. That development there represents 31% site coverage. Most of the townhouse developments that we see in the municipality do not exceed 50% site coverage. In terms of ageing in place and housing affordability, it's a serious issue for us all. I don't see that the current regulations are making things more affordable for anyone. I'm not sure whether the new regulations, if they're approved, will make as much or much of a difference to the affordability. At the moment, we've seen prices in the area skyrocket, and what it's telling us is that if things keep going as they are, not only will people not be able to afford to build in the area, but they might not be able to afford to stay here. That doesn't mean the regulations will have an impact on land values, but it's the reality of what we're facing, I think, all across the state in that regard. In terms of the specific question of why 5 metres and not 2, in terms of open space at the moment, the planning scheme requires that you provide 75 square metres of open space, 35 square metres of that in one area. Under the proposed regulations, you'll be required to provide 75 square metres of open space. The difference being 60 square metres of that will be in the one area. Why the 5 metres? To meet the 35 square metre requirement today, you have to have a minimum dimension of 5 by 7 metres. We are seeing in developments approved today that many of the dwellings are providing at least a 5 metre setback for some or all of the rear setback to satisfy the requirement that exists today. 2 metres, if you're at 2 metres, you can't satisfy your 75 square metre open space requirement. The planning scheme tells us that any area less than a 3 metre dimension doesn't count as secluded or as open space. So at 2 metres, you are then providing, even if it's stayed at 35 square metres, you're providing the 75 square metres in addition to that area in that 2 metre setback.
Just on that, Peter, so you're saying that there's a spectrum between 3 metres and 5 metres here that's actually we're able to play with, but there's a proposal here around the 5 metres, but technically 2 metres would not function, but 3 to 5 metres is the gap?
That's right. So the planning scheme says that the minimum dimension for a usable area of open space is 3 metres. So if we take that as the standard, what we're saying is the difference between 3 and 5 in terms of the open space. Granted that the current requirement is a 5 by 7 metre square box or rectangular box, or rectangle, sorry, that is required for that open space. So the 5 metres in terms of a dimension for open space and as a dimension for rear setback is already one that the municipality and the development industry is used to, because we are using that dimension today. Moving on with regards to, I think the last one was growth zones, and we're coming back to canopy trees. The growth zones around railway stations and activity centres is a very good comment. Council's has done its housing strategy. It identifies the broad framework for how we want to plan the municipality in the future. It identifies that we do need to do further work around those activity centres to determine where that growth may go. We've done the work in Glen Waverley, and we're running an amendment concurrently with this proposal that does see some residential growth going around this activity centre in addition to the growth that's going into the activity centre. We also see some growth going in and around Clayton because we're experiencing growth there by virtue of the university and the way that works. Why not Mount Waverley, Sindel, Pinewood yet? Quite simply, we haven't done the work. We need to go out and see what growth in those activity centres may look like. We need to go and speak to the community in detail about what growth for those centres might look like, because it's not a one-size-fits-all proposal, and what is suitable in Glen Waverley and Oakley and Clayton may not be suitable in Mount Waverley and Pinewood. But certainly we need to come back and do that structure planning work to see how those activity centres may grow and how some growth may occur around them as well.
I just want to turn it back just for a follow-up question, and we'll also open it up to Venkat's question next.
Sure. So just a follow-up question, a statement and a question to make. Through C125, the council and council officers are seeking more powers with a vague assurance to use discretion and relax them within the C125 framework. In my experience, it will simply not work. With the fear of setting precedents, I can only see the council officer simply applying the rules conservatively than applying discretion. The type and amount of discretion, if any, will also depend on the council officer on the job, resulting in unfair outcomes for many. Hence, I foresee dreadful chaos and an avalanche of planning applications going to VCAT, angering residents no end. Hence, the proposed C-125 is not acceptable. The question. Coming to the development of C-125, as I understand, in 2014, just 6 written submissions, bear in mind, just 6 written submissions from ratepayers was used to develop the requirements, the amendments. The community rejected these amendments at last year's consultation through June and August by nearly 2-1, 585 submissions to 326. The council officers and council disregarded majority's wishes and submitted virtually the same amendments to the council for approval in October, virtually same. It's only after we made representations to the councillors and they intervened, we finally got a proper consultation and engagement. Last month's online feedback was emphatic. The majority again rejected these amendments. This time, much wider margin, by much wider margin, 9-1 if you take the winning questions into consideration as a measure, or 5-1 if you take the votes on the first 5 pages. However, the council and the council officers seem to ignore the majority again and pursue the same amendments, this time with more explanation. Why is that the council officer not respecting majority's wishes? Why is the council not respecting the majority's wishes? Why are you not withdrawing the amendments altogether and continue with the current regulations? Why are you not responsive to the majority submissions? How can you justify spending more time, money, and alienating majority of the community even further?
Thank you, Rama. That's a great question. Just to clarify one piece about that, which I think it's hugely valuable, because there's a lot of support here for it. On the online forum, we actually did a scan across positive versus negative nuance, and across the entire forum, it was about a 3-1, so 3 opposed, 1 supportive. But just be conscious that when we do public engagement, it is quite common that when there's a proposed change, you are likely to see that kind of skewing regardless, especially when you introduce these changes. But that was also based on a small sample size, so it wasn't the extreme numbers that you're speaking about, but there were sentiments around that were leaning a certain direction. Yep. But over to you guys.
Thank you, Ayal, and thank you, Rama. Look, it's certainly true to say that both through the initial consultation and the online forums, there has been varying comments, but also inconsistent comments about what people might be concerned about and for what reasons. And I think what will, as we go into some of the questions and maybe some of the suggestions that come out, it'll show you that some of that thinking might not be as different to what might be being proposed under the regulations. Council wears a number of hats and plays a number of different roles. One of those roles is as a representative of the community. Another one of those roles is as a planning authority. And as a planning authority, we have a responsibility to not only plan for today, but to plan for the future and how the municipality will grow over the next not only 5, 10, 20, but 50, 100 years and beyond. Are those decisions and those positions always popular? No, they're not. Does that mean that we shouldn't come out and speak to the community about them, that we shouldn't gauge the opinion, and that we shouldn't make decisions about what types of controls may be appropriate as we continue to grow? That's precisely what we're doing. The council hasn't made its decision as yet. We're here speaking to you again about these changes. Council, as Ayal mentioned, will be considering an in-principle position in March. It doesn't stop there. Council will consider a final position in May. It doesn't stop there. For all people who submitted to the process, what gets established if it goes to that point and council decides to proceed with the changes, and they may not, I'm not sure. An independent panel is established by the state government. Every submitter has the opportunity to come and present their views and their comments to that independent panel. That panel then presents a report back to council with its recommendations about whether the changes are or aren't reasonable. And it's still not over then. It comes back to council. Council considers that panel report and can still decide to do nothing, can still decide to make changes, or can decide to approve the amendment. Ultimately, depending on what the decision might be, if we get that far, it then goes to the Minister for Planning, who can make a decision to either implement as proposed, to change, or to not implement at all. We are very early, even though this process has been going on for a number of years, we still have a lot of water under the bridge to go in terms of not only the final position of council, but what the final makeup of these changes may or may not be.
I might shift to the next question. I might want to bring you in again for this one as well, Rama. But just to jump to the next one, Venkat is question number 3, which had a lot of similarities here, and I wanted to make sure we cover a few points. The things that he's mentioned that are the same, I'll just tell you where we're going through, but I'll read his question. 179 votes, and the key themes here around side and rear setbacks again. This is about open space and setbacks, the housing diversity and the growth zones. And he says, while the fundamental aim of the proposed amendment is to cater for the required increase of around 1.5 million new dwellings while maintaining a garden city character, how many of the proposed 1.5 million dwellings will be contributed to Monash? Also, what measures is Council taking to achieve a garden city character with its own assets? So planting trees in its own median strips, or for example, why did the State and Council choose to subdivide and sell off assets like primary and secondary schools instead of preserving them for greening? Why weren't the unsightly overhead power cables removed to help trees spread their canopies? And he notes, and I won't read too into it, but he says he's not opposed to the general theme of this, but actually isn't sure that it's going to achieve the elements of sustainability, caring for the habitat, and improve the aesthetics of neighbourhoods, but he thinks that the intent here is actually quite good. His specific objections and corresponding recommendations are limit dwellings to no more than 2 per lot. This is a counterintuitive proposal to achieve increased dwellings, and he recommends that we should have a minimum of 3 meters squared per dwelling. And I think in that point, if we can also, the image that you put up about the 31% coverage, I was just curious if that actually addressed the issue of the shoebox style property, and if we can link that to this as well, because I think there's some concerns about whether or not that actually is or isn't what the point was at hand. The second point, he talks about the 2 to 3 large canopies, and should we have one at a shorter height, which is the same point, which we'll speak about a bit later as well. The third one, an increase in rear and side setbacks. I strongly object to this proposal as it severely diminishes the built-up area for single-story homes, and in turn this would force owners to construct multiple-story homes at increased cost. I recommend no change at current, or at best an increased rear setback to 2 meters. The next point is around the 60 square meters, which was alluded to in Rama's question, and then also reducing site coverage to 50%. This compounds the above restrictions and further constricts dwelling sizes. And the final point is around the sample layouts shown in the information brochures for GRZ4 and NRZ4, which depict one-car single garages, which means residents will more likely park their second car in the streets, which not only leads to congestion but also defeats the intended garden city outcome. And he recommends no change. There's another question that's going to be presented later which specifically speaks to this point, which we'll get to as well. But I wanted to just get those key points around how many proposed dwellings are there going to be in Monash? What has Monash done with its own assets? Can we do the limited dwellings where we've got 300 meters squared per dwelling? And what about increased rear sidebacks in multiple-story homes? And finally, the point around the site coverage.
Yeah. Again, thanks, Ayal. I think it's important to point out or clarify in this question, before I get to those, that the City of Monash did have 7 school sites that were discontinued or were closed down by government or state government over a number of years. They weren't and aren't council assets. They were state government assets and they were sold by the state government. In terms of why didn't council buy them to preserve the greening, I think that I could well say that at in excess of $20 million per site for one of those school sites, it's probably not a great investment in open space in one chunk, and I dare say that council's money could and would be better used in different ways in terms of the open space areas that we've got. Those properties weren't available or offered to council free of charge, and perhaps if they would have been, and maybe should have been, we would have gladly accepted them as open space areas, but it's just economically not viable to go out and to purchase them on the open market, competing with developers who are looking to make a return on them. In terms of some of the specific objections or recommendations, the only place the council is proposing to limit development to 2 lots per dwelling is in the neighbourhood residential zones. Nowhere else in the municipality, and for the majority of the municipality, are we looking to restrict, through a planning scheme control, no more than 2 dwellings on a lot. Those neighbourhood residential zones have adopted and do say that minimum lot size created should be 300 square metres. So on this, we agree with the submitter. The large issue is to apply the 300 square metre rule across the municipality. It does away with that very diversity that we talk about. It does away with that ability for people to design homes and design units to best fit their needs and their block of land. What a 300 square metre requirement on the majority of blocks in the municipality would mean is that you'd be limiting them to 2 dwellings. The vast majority of our sites are 750 square metres or less. So if you apply a 300 square metre to each of those, the dual occupancy is nothing else. This amendment does not propose to do that. We've spoken, I think, a little bit about the 5 metre versus the 2 metre setback. Excuse me, I've got a cold and my voice is fading in and out, so I apologise. And the ability to construct single-storey houses and the restrictions that this will create. We do have some slides, but they are further in answer to one of the other questions that do show an existing house in the Glen Waverley area, a triple-fronted brick dwelling that has a site coverage, and it says what the site coverage is. It then shows what a redevelopment of that site as a single large house looks like, and then what at no more than 50%, and then what a house at 60% looks like. So, thank you. So this is an existing house, 16% site coverage. This is what you would typically see the housing stock built in the 1960s in the area. If we move to the next slide, the large house or the large building, it's actually an apartment building, but be that as it may, that site coverage is 60% of the site. So when we talk about site coverage and when we talk about areas to be developed, today, as the regulations sit, a person can come and build a single house on that footprint and not have to speak to any neighbours about it. It's as of right under the building regulations. If we move to the next site, this is actually the actual site where that first slide was on. It represents a large single house that has a 47% site coverage. Now, in building envelope terms, if you took the top story off, you would easily get a 4-bedroom home or a 5-bedroom home with 2 or 3 bathrooms in that footprint. The site coverage of that, with all the paving and all the concrete, is still less than 80% of the site.
Great. Is that it, Peter?
Thank you.
Great. Rama, did you want to follow up on any of those on behalf of Venkat?
Sure. I think you mentioned that, Peter, about the 47% coverage and what have you, but I didn't quite understand the outcome of what the council is going to do. My question is, what is the council going to do about the large single dwellings that are built fence to fence with no vegetation? And isn't that the source of the problem? And isn't that the source of the angst amongst many of the residents here? Why is the council focusing on units and townhouses where there are already a significant number of rules in place to limit the amount of coverage you can have? Why is the council focusing on the little guys as opposed to the large dwellings that are really ruining the neighborhood?
Yeah, just a show of hands by clapping. How many have supported that question? All right. Thank you. So just over on that one.
Yeah. If we can go back to those pictures we had up before, I think the little guys versus the big guys might be in terms of the size of the dwelling.
Is that what you meant, Rama? Yeah.
Yeah. But it's a resident who chooses to live in a large house. It's a resident that chooses to live in a unit. We see every day neighbours objecting and raising concerns with council about unit development next door to them. The problem with single houses is they are as of right and you don't get an opportunity to object. The differences that you get are the dwelling with a 47% site coverage has greater setbacks from the side and has greater setbacks from the rear. It provides some relief to the neighbouring properties. If we go to the slide before that, and the 60 square, that is essentially what you can construct today. If you apply the unit mentality to that, that is the footprint that you could achieve for 2 or 3 dwellings on a site. Why do we look at unit developments and not single houses? We look at both, and the controls affect both. But we all know, given the involvement in the town planning process, that a lot of people feel and have told us that the impact that upon them and their houses as a result of inappropriate unit developments is significant, and they were asking council to do something. This is the response, and C125 is the response that we propose will go some way to providing some balance on the types of developments that are occurring. It will make development a little bit different, in some instances a little bit smaller. We will argue, given the developments we see, that in terms of site coverage, in terms of setback and in terms of dwelling sizes, only those very, very large unit developments will suffer a consequence. And for the majority of applications that we receive and are approved by council, only minor modifications will be needed to satisfy these requirements.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you. We're just going to move on to the next question. Rowan, thanks for coming up. And next up, we've got Alexander Van Stan. Apologies for the misspelling of his name, but you'll see on the slide the correct spelling. And his question is about zone boundaries and state regulations in particular. So, Alex, thanks for joining us. His question received 138 votes on the online portal, and so he's had a fair bit of support. It was actually the 5th most popular question. We wanted to get him involved.
All right, thanks. And thanks for this lovely democratic opportunity where us as residents, I think, can hold our elected representatives to account. Very important democratic principle here. As such, my question goes to the Right Honourable Lord Mayor, and I'd like it to be answered directly by the Lord Mayor, not referred, because I think it deserves the response of the highest elected official in this hall tonight. As a veteran of Afghanistan, I believe strongly in the individual liberties of landowners from the oppression of government. I've spent 10 years in the Australian Army and put my life on the line in defence of this principle, amongst others. I think Council needs to understand not only this, but the significant sacrifices landowners undertake to be able to purchase land and have the rights of their land and own a little piece of Australia. In saying that, what gives the council the right now to attack my and my fellow residents' rights in regards to our land? Why are our land's rights being significantly eroded by this highly restrictive proposed amendment? And I say this coming from this background. So specifically, Amendment C125 proposes that the land on which I pay council rates for be rezoned from GRZ2, so General Residential Zone 2, to a Neighbourhood Residential Zone 3. Now, why has the boundary between GRZ2 and NRZ3 been set haphazardly in the middle of Riviera Street, Mount Waverley? Why is my neighbour, essentially, allowed to have a 1 metre setback? And why am I restricted to a 6 metre setback? And why has my site coverage gone down from 40% to 40% from 60%? I say this noting that these amendments haven't been enacted yet. In this grand scheme of things, what will be the difference if the boundaries moved properly to the east, to 4 Riviera Street? How does this amendment meet the intent of state regulations governing the critical shortage of houses in Melbourne and the development plan to increase the supply of affordable housing to Victorians? How specifically does it address the intent of Residential Zones State of Play overarching report released by the Environment, Land, Water and Planning Department, which states that Melbourne has to build 380,000 homes over the next 10 years, and 70% of these have to be in established areas? And before I get the meta answer, I'd just like to caveat here, my intention is not to build a concrete jungle. I simply want to subdivide my property and build a property for myself and my mother, and I still think I could do that and keep in the intent of the gun character of Monash.
Alex, thank you so much. And By a show of hands, there's a support for that particular question. A fair few in the room. Thanks so much. So, Alex, I really appreciate the question, and I totally understand that there's a lot of... it's a very emotional and deeply challenging issue to have been zoned so close to a boundary zone. In particular, the question you posed does have some specifics which Council can respond to. The Mayor actually isn't the one who's proposing this amendment necessarily, so it's not actually in her position to necessarily have the details around why that's been done. So it's probably more appropriate to have the people who've actually made the initial suggestions and recommendations around this, which is the two gentlemen to my left, who have great insights around where they've come to the conclusions for this. The councillors are here on the left actually to listen, because exactly your question and your point is what she's going to take into account along with the other councillors when they make that decision. So just so we actually get the most effective use of the time and actually get the responses to the questions that you have, I'm going to actually turn it over to the planners here. Over to Sean.
Great, thanks. Yep. Thanks, Alex, and thanks for your question. That's on? Right. I'll probably deal with the first one, which is your specific question around why is the boundary there. And I guess the first thing I'd say, it's not haphazard. I understand it may appear that way to you. If we can bring the slide up, which is the next slide. So that's an extract from our new residential zones website, and I'm sure you've seen that as part of your research. Alex's house is the property with the little blue house sign on it. The blue boundary there is the proposed general residential 4 zone. The green boundary is the proposed neighbourhood residential 3 zone. Excuse me. And the blue zone is the proposed neighbourhood residential 2 zone. And then the green portion of land on the bottom right-hand side is a creek and a bike track. So the neighbourhood residential zones that are proposed through Mount Waverley, Glen Waverley, basically follow creek lines. So the closer you are to a creek line, we're saying that's a more sensitive area, and that the landscaping should be a stronger element in the way that development happens in those areas. In the case of Riviera Street, the properties that back directly onto, K Street, the properties that back directly onto the creek are in the neighbourhood residential 2 zone, which has what people consider to be more onerous or more stringent controls on siding and landscaping. And as we move away from the creek, those controls graduate down back to the standard suburban areas, which are in the blue areas. Now, Riviera Street, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, starts on the flat at Torella Drive, and as you get into Riviera Street proper, so the number 14, the 2 houses in the blue are actually not known as houses in Riviera Street. They have signage to houses in Riviera Street. So the first 2 houses in Riviera Street obviously are 1 and 2, which is the one to the north of you, and you're the first house in there. So your neighbour to the west fronts Torella Drive, and that's part of the reason for the zone boundary being there. The other part is that when we looked at the way the landform is out in basically along those creeks, where the boundary between the light blue and the green is selected is basically where the topography changes and you start moving down the hill towards the creek line in that instance. So
is that a creek line just next to his property? Is that what that is?
No, the creek line is on the if we go back to the drawing, the creek line is on the bottom right-hand side.
On the other side.
So correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, but if you go out of your front door and turn right, you'll be walking down Riviera Street downhill.
Yeah, but
right.
I can't see the creek line at all.
Well, it's I won't point on there because it won't show up, but it's further down the hill. Yeah, so we're talking about 2 different things. We're talking about properties that abut the reserve, and then properties that are in the valley that forms part of that reserve. So the reason for the boundary is that's a logical boundary. It's the back of a fence line with properties that face Torella Drive, and the properties in K Street and Riviera Street have a topographical relationship to the valley that forms part of that creek. So that's the reason for that. Going on to some of the other questions around your rights as a property owner, certainly understand what you're saying, but the reality is at the moment the planning scheme places regulations right across the state on everybody that owns land. So that serves you in the sense that your neighbour can't come and establish an abattoir or other nefarious activities. What comes with that is a bit of an obligation on you also to comply with the planning scheme. So nobody has the absolute right to do anything they want with their land, and I think everybody knows that, from beekeepers to people that want to keep pigeons and those sorts of things. So the planning controls are there to try and balance people's right to enjoy the land and also balance the right of their neighbour to have some enjoyment of their land. And in terms of how does it accord with the Planning Environment Act, As Peter mentioned earlier in the evening, Council wears a number of hats, and the hat that we're wearing in terms of the Planning Environment Act is an obligation excuse me, for Council to plan for current and future generations, but plan for the whole of the municipality, not just for particularly what someone in particular might want to do with their land, going back to that attempting to balance out different land use activities. So we think that this, obviously it's open for discussion. We have attempted to develop an amendment that balances those objectives by protecting sensitive areas and encouraging growth in others.
So there's a bit of support in the room for the support around planning. It's about planning and protecting certain areas that have that heritage or that environmental overlay. Alex, did you have a follow-up question?
Yes, I did. Now, in regards to the actual zoning and the what I believe are the very haphazard drawings of the boundaries, I'll just make it clear that I believe that as you come in, there's actually 2 houses to the right of me. And I just did a quick look on Google Maps just to confirm, and it certainly looks like that case. So I'm still sort of not sure how you sort of put that boundary in. Now, secondly, I've got a supplementary question, and this goes to sort of the purpose of why I'm here. Now, I've got a very specific question in regards to 2 Riviera Street, which is my property. Now, when at the community meeting, I believe it was the 10th of February at the Oakley Town Hall, I made a very specific point to ask the Honourable Lord Mayor if she would answer specific questions, because me personally, I feel like I'm wasting everyone's time here getting up and talking about my land. Now, I've emailed her, and I've had the email here, and I'll table it or whatever you want to call it, and I note that there's been a significant amount of responses, one from the federal MP, Anna Burke, one from the state MP, but I haven't received a response from the Mayor or any people from the Monash City Council. I just want to know why the Mayor doesn't think I'm worthy of response.
I'll just give a quick answer to that. But on the night of the event, so RSA was actually responsible for the event that was hosted at the Oakley Town Hall. And so the reason why we actually initially framed the event to not necessarily answer questions on that night, because we were trying to still surface questions, but halfway into the event we realized that people actually wanted questions answered that night. And so we actually opened up the floor, like we will later tonight, to people to ask their questions as well. And we were also trying to get orderly questions as a part of that. So I actually instructed the Mayor and other people that night to make sure that we had a chance to really surface questions first, make sure people had a chance to think those through, so we could do it in an orderly manner. But it was at a point where people really wanted to hear those questions answered that night, and we did change that throughout the night, and it was open for questions. So that wasn't necessarily the Mayor's fault in that regard. And also, with regards to this particular issue, the consultation that was run was meant to have people putting their submissions in directly to this process, or through directly to council, so they can respond and get the appropriate people at council responding to your specific question. And we do appreciate that you're absolutely making the point of, if it's a specific residential property question, that's what we have planners here tonight to answer those questions. And we do want to make sure we're dealing with specific questions on a per person basis. But then if there's ones that we think a range of people are supportive of, we're here to answer them so that multiple people can get their answers at the same time to be as efficient and effective with that time. Did you want to comment any further on that, or was there anything else? I
don't think so, unless...
No. So that was the main reason for that. Was there anything, just with regards to those particular questions around state environmental planning, did you have any questions on that?
No, I think I've asked all my questions.
Great.
Whether they've been answered or not is something I'll analyse later.
No worries. Thank you, Alex. And we can send you the more information as you will, and you're also welcome to ask follow-up questions on that afterwards with planners if there's anything specific. Thanks so much, Alex. We'll just turn over to the next one. We're now going to get Sally Walker. She had 169 votes on her question, and the key themes here are around stormwater, drainage, and impermeable surfaces. So I'll hand it over to you, Sally. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity of being here tonight. I'd just like to say that tonight I'm mainly here to support the environmental qualities of Valley Reserve and the Scotchman's Creek corridor. I'm not here as a resident per se. So I support the proposed amendments C125 to the Monash planning scheme. In particular, I support the proposed new zones, NRZ2 Creek Abuttal and NRZ3 Creek Environs. The requirements for these two zones will assist in retaining the green city environment of Monash. We are losing too many trees, with the current redevelopments where virtually all vegetation is removed when a property is demolished and too little garden space is left with the new development. Under the present rules, the percentage of the lot that can be covered with impermeable surfaces is too high, which results in stormwater surges each time it rains, to the detriment of our local creeks. The proposed new regulations, NRZ2 and NRZ3, will require a higher percentage of the lot to be left with a permeable surface. This will help to alleviate this issue. In the interests of the public understanding where Council is coming from, would Council be interested in playing a role in an education campaign to help people to understand the issues with stormwater drainage and how this all relates to permeable and impermeable surfaces?
Just from the crowd, so we've got a fair few people here supportive of this particular question as well. Over to you, Sean.
Great. Thank you for your question, Sally. You're right. So one of the key issues for council in terms of a non-planning responsibility of ours is the maintenance of the local drainage system. Now, most of Monash has been established in the 50s and 60s, and the design requirements for the drainage system is, from memory, about 35% site coverage. So Res Code, in allowing 60% site coverage, is almost doubling the amount of potential runoff. That doesn't take into account hard surface from driveways and things. So you can have up to 80% of your site covered, as I'm sure you're aware, which is nearly double the amount that the drainage system was designed for. How we deal with that generally at the moment on sites is through on-site detention systems, where developers will attempt to hold some of that water back and discharge it more slowly over time, in theory, if the rain dissipates. Obviously, the issue potentially with climate change is less rain but closer together, and some of our forecasting and flow modelling is a little bit out now because of those changes as the way rain occurs. So it's certainly something that we're very mindful of. In the NRZ zones around the creeks, in part because of that stormwater issue, but also in part because of their creek lines and their more sensitive areas, and to keep them vegetated and allow for infiltration, the amendment proposes that reduction. Not back to the design capacity of the drains originally, but down to something that we think provides a balance between being able to develop in a much more sensitive environment than you've got in the general suburban areas of Monash, but also enjoy the benefit of the creek and make a contribution to that Valley Reserve or the Scotchman's Creek area. So that's the main thrust behind the amendment in those areas. And look, the other thing I'd say for those areas, and this isn't to diminish the people that are in them who support them or don't support them, the total area of neighbourhood residential that's proposed across Monash is in the order of 22% of the residential land municipality, but the vast bulk of that is in the Dandenong Creek escarpment area. So the areas where we're reducing it are very constrained around what we have interpreted as being flowing directly into those creek lines and forming part of the valley that is associated with the creek. In terms of other things that Council has done or may do, we have a sustainability strategy, and from time to time we run waterwise programs, drains to the bay programs, those sorts of things, and it's certainly something that we can look at in the future. Our urban design people have worked closely with not only on council projects but with developers and the industry around what's called water sensitive urban design, which has an acronym that and including those. So even and there's a range of technologies that are available to developers nowadays where you can effectively pave an area in a practical sense, but it still remains permeable. So there's still a way to go with some of those things, but there's technical solutions to meeting some of those challenges.
Thanks, Sean. Did you have a follow-up, Sally?
Well, yes, and I understand that there are technical solutions in many cases, but I just wonder how many people actually understand the implications of them and whether they really understand how much damage is done to the creeks by rushing water. We monitor the creeks on a regular basis, and we see the damage that's done with erosion to the banks all the time. And it's amazing. You've got a little creek that is normally about that height, and after a real shower of rain, it's about 1.5 meters deep. So people don't, I think, understand just how much water rushes off and how quickly it rushes off. And that's why we're concerned about the increasing amount of totally impermeable surface on blocks. And we support any changes that require more permeable surface on a block.
Great. Any follow-ups on that? Sounds like a bit of statement. Thank you.
No, I don't have anything else.
Thank you, Sally. That's perfect. Next up, we're going to... we actually were meant to have a question from Kim Wilson, and he last minute said he couldn't arrive, but his question did get a fair number of votes, 616 votes. It was the second most popular question, and we said we would honour every single one of these questions, so I'll ask this question on his behalf. Has the proposed amendment C125 taken into consideration the fact this policy, if passed, will drive away buyers and developers who can improve the area as a whole by replacing old rundown buildings with new ones? As a new landowner in the area, going through the building process, it is hard enough as it is to build a house with all of the current residential codes. I've spent considerable money on land to build a particular house. The changes proposed in this amendment would make it impossible to build anywhere near the house on my block and dramatically devalue my property. Over to you.
Thanks, Ayal. It's a real shame that Kim Wilson's not here tonight to ask this question because it's difficult to answer. I don't have a good understanding of what the issues here might be. In terms of the size of house and type of house they might want to build and where these regulations or proposed regulations may cause that issue. Insofar as...
But has the question, have we taken into account the fact that this policy, if passed, will devalue properties across a range of zones? And I think there's people here who are concerned about the fact that this will have impacts on their policy, on their properties, their ability to develop, and the fact that they will lose the value they may have wanted to create with that property as a result of this policy.
Yeah. The simple answer to that is there is no block that exists today that under these regulations won't be able to be developed. What you can develop on that site may change depending on what you want to do. Land value and the issue of land value and the impact of planning controls is a really difficult and uncertain one to answer. Some people say that development potential equals land value. We do see that in some instances. In some of the residential growth zones that have occurred in other municipalities, we have seen growth and value go up. But we've also seen in municipalities where far greater amounts of neighbourhood residential, far lesser amounts of development are possible, land values continue to be strong and continue to grow. So where are those places was the question. If we think to some of the areas around Blackburn Lake, if we think some of the inner city municipalities such as Burundara, Camberwell, Kew that have neighbourhood residential zones that are quite restrictive on development, hasn't hurt their land value at all. Places like the city of Glen Ira have introduced 75 or 80% of the municipality's neighbourhood residential no more than 2 units. I don't see their land values going backwards quickly. The truth is that the land value, that when people buy a property, they buy it for the reasons that they want. Some want to develop, some don't want development to happen around them. Some value treescape and canopy and environment more. And the land value is only as strong as the market, and that is not only driven by the amount of development potential of a block of land.
But just a question from the ground. Thank you for that. How many people in the room are supportive of this particular question, had this question on the top of their mind? Okay, so there's a fair few in here about the devaluation question. Is value something that we looked at what the impact was going to be of this proposed amendment when we made the recommendations?
Ayal, it's something that under the Planning and Environment Act or under the planning schemes we don't have regard to.
Okay.
And we can't have regard to because we don't know, and no one can know with any certainty or project what the impact on land values might be as a result of a change. Our responsibilities, as we said earlier, are towards the proper planning of an area and making sure that not only today but in the future that area continues to develop or grow in a way that is appropriate without being able to project with any certainty, and there's no one that can project with any certainty what the impact on values might be. We have a number of properties that have single dwelling covenants upon them where you can't construct more than one house without going through a lengthy process. Those sit next to development sites. The land value is no different.
Okay.
That's the best we can answer.
Just another follow-up on that one real quick. So, I mean, if I'm in the process of developing right now, and what's the lead time before the impacts of this policy come into place if it's approved? And so if I'm in the middle of development, will this impact on my property development right now? Or the point that was made before about people actually going to a point where we're going to see mad pushes to VCAT to actually try to get amendments to, what's come through. What are the impacts? When's it going to happen? And, what if I'm in the middle of developing property right now?
So working on assumptions, and let's assume that council in May adopts something, whether it be this amendment, whether it be a version of. But if council does, it becomes what's known as a seriously entertained planning policy. So it's not law yet, but it's been adopted by council, is going through the process, and it's given some weight. Applications that are lodged before that occurs, we will have to have some regard, but obviously as they come in and are designed before the regulations, there's that due regard given. In terms of fully when these will be is if the whatever the Minister for Planning ends up signing off and making law, that's when those regulations will be expected to be had regard to. But again, in saying that, it's important to understand that these requirements, as are the current requirements, are not ironclad, non-negotiable requirements. Council retains the ability to, where appropriate, diverge from them. And Rama earlier talked about the VCAT process. The VCAT process is the safeguard in all this. If a resident thinks that council has got it wrong, and many residents do, you have the opportunity to go to an independent tribunal and test that decision. And that doesn't go away.
Was that how much money?
Well, in terms of the VCAT process, and I'm not sure what the lodgement fees are at the moment, but I think they're up around the $1,000-odd mark in terms of lodging a proceeding. What the costs are from then depend on each individual. Many people will represent themselves. If you go and have someone engaged to represent you, it depends on who you find and what level of representation that you want.
I think there's a bit in that, and we can touch on it a bit later when you get to the planners. But I want to move on to the next question. So thank you for answering that question. The next one's also from Soter Tiong. It had 126 votes. Soter also couldn't join us tonight and asked that we ask his question on his behalf. And he also explained that the top 3 points in his question were already covered by previous questions. So just to get to the grunt of the bottom 3, he says, my key questions are, why are the proposed amendments so extreme? Can council consider some compromise on them? These amendments, and the second point is, these amendments will restrict my ability to build a house of sufficient size to cater for my growing family. How will these amendments enable livability when residents will be required to live in a shoebox-like house? And the third point is, creating growth zones near the vicinity of shopping centres simply does not make sense. There's already a struggle with the lack of parking and infrastructure to support the commercial growth in precincts such as that of Kingsway. As a longtime resident of the city, it's great to see such growth, but I'm also concerned that the infrastructure is not catching up quick enough. Why is the council choosing these particular areas as growth zones when there's already enough development going on, while restricting growth in other areas?
To answer the first question first, in terms of the amendments being so extreme, I certainly don't hold that view in terms of that they are different to what is proposed today. Having seen the numbers and types of applications that we receive and typically how they respond, and bearing in mind some of the earlier commentary about dual occupancy developments generally being about, the 45 to 50% mark, the ability to continue to develop sites. It's no secret, and there is no secret that some of these developments may get a little bit smaller, but it's certainly not making them shoebox and undevelopable based on the type of land and the size of land that we have generally in this municipality. In the third question, we hear a bit of a contrary view to perhaps what Rama was saying in terms of growth around activity centres. It's our responsibility to plan how development occurs. That is about identifying areas where it might be appropriate for higher density to go. I think that not only council, not only state government, but governments around the world recognise that putting higher density and growth in and around activity centres is the way to go and is a good thing. And why is it good? Because you place the majority or a large number of people close to shops, close to facilities, close to transport, the hope being that you might provide an opportunity for them to perhaps not own a car or use a car because what they need is within easy walking distance. There's little use in having an apartment building out the back 3 kilometres away from the shopping centre where everyone has to own a vehicle. That growth comes with a trade-off, and the trade-off is that your residential hinterland, where the majority of us live, experiences a different level of growth and perhaps a more moderated level of growth. This is what this amendment is proposing. A lot of people are saying the balance is wrong. That's certainly something council needs to consider about whether the balance is right and how far the controls go. But it's all about whether you agree with the actual controls or not. I hope that the premise of the controls being directing growth to where growth is appropriate is a sound one, because that's where our policies from the state government as the overarching planning authority is leading us, appropriate growth in appropriate locations.
So I'm just hearing there is potential for compromise on this. Thank you. And some of the things, it sounds like open space is a hot issue that's come up multiple times. It's around, rear and side setbacks are a hot issue. And so for councillors, this is a space where maybe we'll see open for, differences of what we've proposed versus what we actually end up with as a result of...
Yeah, look, I think it's no secret that, the rear setback, the side setback, and the amount of open space are probably the three main issues. And look, they're probably the three main changes that the amendment proposes to consider. They are... the housing strategy has been adopted, so the premise of growth in certain locations is now a council policy. Council will certainly be considering, after this process and going into May and beyond, whether these controls are the right ones for the City of Monash. Okay, so there's room for compromise. I'm going to jump to the next question. Jacinta Davenport, 110 votes. Themes here around family, home development and growth zones, and some similarities in question. If council wants to increase green space in the area, then they should look at other options instead of infringing on people's ability to build a house, which meets their family needs. There's been a lot of building in the area over the last 5 years, which would not meet these requirements. To restrict people now from building similar houses to those already in the area is not a reasonable solution. This proposed amendment could substantially increase the price people have to pay to build. How is the council supporting families who want to develop but will need bespoke plans to be drawn up rather than people being able to utilise lower-cost kit homes? Do you want to take that one, Sean?
Yeah, thanks. If I sort of start with, the first part of the question, which was about green space and what's happened in the last 5 years. So what people experience in their neighbourhood and how they live in their neighbourhood, it's a combination between what's in the street, obviously, and what's in their yard. So as far as what council's doing in that street environment, we've actually, coincidentally, we've just nearing the end of a consultation on our street tree strategy, where we've got, from memory, space for about 120,000 street trees across Monash. There's quite a few vacancies in those spaces at the moment, mainly through attrition and over time. Obviously, trees are living organisms and they get a bit long in the tooth and need replacement. So in a very simple sense for neighbourhoods, that's an obligation that council is taking up and looking at. In terms of what's happened in the last 5 years. I think this is one of the sites we looked at quite closely in terms of where Jacinta lives. So the way the planning system works is, as Peter's mentioned earlier, we're governed by the state planning framework and the Planning Environment Act. So the state sets a high-level policy about where you should do, and effectively for us that is about directing growth to activity centres and protecting the suburbs, which is why the government gave us the 3 residential zones a couple of years ago. Was to, one, residential growth is to direct the growth, and the general residential and the neighbourhood residential to do the other part of Plan Melbourne, which is protect the suburbs. So that's the overall framework in which we have to operate, and we are operating. It then comes down to our local planning scheme, which at the moment talks about planting canopy trees and protecting garden character. This amendment is tying up the other end of that by changing some of the standards, some of the existing 34 standards, or we're not changing all of them. So the number doesn't increase, it's just what that standard means changes. And then, so that's the framework at a local level for Jacinta if she was looking at developing her site. She would then lodge a planning permit if she needed to, and we would assess that based on the local planning policy. But as Peter also mentioned earlier, in the standards that we have now and into the future, there is discretion there. So we start at a high state level, we come down and look at what the local planning scheme says, and then our officers go and look at, well, what's in the street? How close to the street is what's in the scheme? And in this particular instance, without identifying the street, what's in that street is very different from what's in the planning scheme in terms of an aspiration for the garden character. So council has discretion in that interest to say, and the overall objective is that things fit in with the character of the street. So if the character of Jacinta's street is slightly different from what the scheme says, officers and council have the ability to vary those standards to say, well, we're going to change this a little bit, and you can, because you're actually fitting in with what's in there. So no one will be in a situation in terms of responding to those variable standards where they're the last cab off the rank and have to carry the can for everyone to plant a tree. It's simply not going to happen. The system has discretion to respond to local circumstances.
So there is discretion on a per basis? Okay.
On a per application basis. In terms of the bespoke homes versus I wouldn't call it a kit home because they're much nicer than kit homes, but the volume builders like your Metricons, your Porter Davies, Carlisle Homes, those sorts of things, we have spoken to several of those large volume builders early on in the piece. The main thing they were interested in was the change to the setbacks and how we were going to assess those standards. The upshot of that was that generally was, oh, well, we'll bring the package that we have already designed for Glen Ira or Burundara or these other places that have slightly higher standards around siting. We'll just bring that product to Monash. So the large players in the industry are set up to deal with these schedules. You may have trouble with some of the smaller builders, but the flip side, well, the other part of that is that if Jacinta's talking about a single dwelling and she has a rectangular block, and if it's around the average size, you'll fit a 38, 40 square single story Metricon home, not to endorse any particular brand, a large volume builder home, you will fit that on a 700 square metre block and comply with the site coverage of 50%, the 7.5 metre front setback and the 5 metre rear setback. So those things will fit in comfortably. So a 40 square home is something that's capable of having 4 or 5 bedrooms in it, 2 or 3 bathrooms and several areas. So where it gets a problem, and this amendment doesn't make it any better or worse, generally is with the volume builders is they shy away from court bowls. So if you're in a court bowl, obviously a rectangular house is, and that's where the builder themselves might put some redesign costs onto the owner, but not directly on a normal block as part of the amendment.
I'll ask another question a little bit.
Hey, Al, sorry, can I just add to that?
Yep.
The largest plan we could find from one of the form builders was about a 59 square home. That fits on our average block size under Amendment C125 without any changes.
It was 2-story.
2-story, 58, 60 square. So that doesn't change.
Is that single story or a double?
No, double.
Double story.
Double.
Yeah.
So it doesn't change the ability to go out and source one of those.
And what's the impact on
large
a single?
volumes.
What's the impact on a single store?
I think Sean mentioned that. Was Sean?
It's around 40 square.
Around
so
40
the,
square?
the simple math of it is if you've got a 700 square metre block, 50% site coverage is 350 square metres. That translates into, and I'm not doing it just by the math. I've looked at the sites. That's roughly a 38, 39 square dwelling with a double garage in it.
Okay. So single and double. Yep. Okay, great. Thank you. We'll just move on to the next question so we get to a few more. And I might ask a follow-up from that question in a later one. But canopy trees, how many people are concerned about the canopy tree requirement attached to this proposed amendment? Okay, and just for the councillors, Mackenzie, just by a show of hands, how many people have a canopy tree issue? Great, thank you. So the next one's from Chao Zhang, 109 votes. Chao also couldn't join us, but he did have specific questions around this and had a fair few supporters for it. So based on the proposed amendment C125, my property will be classified into a focused housing growth zone and general residential zone 6, GRZ 6. This requires me to plant 2 canopy trees. Based on my past experience living near properties with canopy trees, here are my concerns. 1, damaged and upturned driveways due to tree roots resulting in huge restoration costs. Leaves in your house gutters require a professional to clean gutters at least twice a year, or they can result in expensive to replace blockages and rotting gutters. 3, large branches fall onto houses and property, causing costly damage during windy and extreme weather. 4, it blocks out valuable sunlight, especially when you have higher buildings all around and already don't get enough light into the house. We don't need the shade as we already have enough of it. For the property with the tree, number 5, there will be non-stop complaints from neighbors to get rid of the tree. This is what happened to a recent neighbors of ours. And Chow spoke to me about the fact that his recent neighbors, they complained for a while until the tree was eventually removed. And 6, the canopy trees are for areas with more open space, such as heritage environmental areas, not growth areas where you're planning to have high housing density. Has council considered requiring shrubs or smaller trees rather than canopy trees? And just before we turn to your response, if you want to show, there's a slide that was given by another resident here that just showed the damage of a tree. It was actually, Rama provided this before because it was linked to his question, which is a tree that actually fell over on his property, and over the year it actually cost him about $25,000 in repair costs on his property as a result of having that tree. And so I just wanted your feedback on that particular question.
Okay, well, if you can just flick back to that image, sort of talk about that. Now, I'm not sure if that's in Monash or not, but just looking at the image on the left-hand side, they look like some sort of cypress, and I think, Rama, we've spoke about this quite some time ago. So if I'm right from memory, that was a cypress row, or pencil pines, yeah, they're a form of cypress. So the other thing I'd say in looking at it, it looks like they've been pruned up one side. So no, I'm looking at one side of it. They look like they're dead or something on one side. So the short answer is they are not the type of vegetation that council requires to be planted in landscape plans. We're very cognizant of the fact that these are trees that are going into an urban environment, and that we wouldn't be not only into the future, but now we don't require the planting of things that you'll see growing out the front of this building, so 20, 30 metre gum trees. So that's pretty much all I want to say about that. But in terms of the canopy tree requirement, it's a requirement that council places on development applications now. So it does not apply to the mum and dad building the single house. So it only applies to medium density development or a dual occupancy development. So if you're doing a knockdown rebuild, there is no obligation on the person doing that to plant a canopy tree or to plant anything, basically. Because it is the way that the state standard controls work. So the landscaping requirement doesn't apply to single dwellings under Res Code. It's as simple as that. Now, I'm not saying whether that's good or bad, but that's the way that it works. So if you want to build a single dwelling, there's no landscaping requirement. You don't need a planning permit from council in most cases. You go to a private building surveyor, comply with the siting requirements of Res Code, and away you go. As for medium density development, at the moment, the Monash planning scheme requires the planting of canopy trees. It's something that regularly occurs. We get with development applications that come in. It's a site plan, it's a development plan, and the last plan there, generally, if they've done a pre-application with our officers, is there's a landscape plan. So it's an existing requirement that we have in the scheme and apply. What we have now is the opportunity, so it sits in the front end of the policy section of the scheme, which is planning jargon for the high-end objective stuff.
So those trees that are required right now, though, it's one tree and it's a certain height?
No, there's no number in the scheme, so it will depend on the character of the area, and how many trees the developer's taking out, and if the area is heavily treed, and the size of the units and how many units. So generally it's between 2 and 3 trees. So there might be 2 in the front and 1 in the back, which is roughly what goes in. So, and that has been the practice in this organisation and in pretty much every council across suburban Melbourne for a long time. The change that occurred a couple of years ago when the new residential zones came in was councils had the ability to put a landscaping requirement in the schedule, which is the thing that hopefully most of you have read, which is the list of ingredients that that you put into your design. So the design might be a dual occupancy, but those proportions may change based on that list of ingredients. So it is not a change of practice for this organisation to ask for canopy trees. What we have now is we're taking advantage of the schedule, allowing us to say, well, in this area, generally 2 trees of this number, and that number is is linked back to the height that you're allowed in the zone. So it basically sends a signal to the development industries. Well, you don't need to call us to find out how many trees you need to plan as part of your landscape plan. In that schedule, if you start with 2 trees on your development, that's already something that we've ticked off. Obviously, we look at and assess the landscape plan. The development industry are very good now in terms of species selection, not only the development industry, but the arboricultural industry. The person building the house has to give a 7-year guarantee. They're not going to go and buy a tree that is going to take off and rip up footings and things, and we wouldn't approve something like that anyway. So it is not a change in practice. It is simply, from our point of view, making the planning scheme more transparent about what our expectations are to meet that objective of garden character in those suburban areas.
And is there some maintenance requirements is council covering the requirement of maintaining these trees, or there's concerns about other alternative trees that are considered here rather than just having canopy trees?
So generally in most landscaping plans that come in, there'll be a number of elements to it, like sound like Jamie Drew, but any good garden, you'll have a bit of height. And the main purpose of the canopy tree is to give a bit of shade and a bit of screening and break up that form, the built form of the dwellings throughout the suburbs. So you'll have 1 or 2 trees, potentially for some shrubs, ground covers, and hopefully a bit of real grass.
Okay.
It doesn't apply to single dwellings simply because Res Code does not require it to apply to single dwellings. Look, we perhaps can talk about those questions. You sound like you know a bit about Res Code, so maybe we can talk about it in more detail later.
How far away from the dual occupancy would it need to be?
Well, what the controls, I suppose what it does is, we don't specify that. A landscape architect and the designer will determine what the best location and what the best distance is. What we have at the moment is we design a house, then we come to a landscaping plan and the designer says, where am I going to put the trees? I'll put one there and I'll put one there. What this control allows designers and developers to do is to know up front and actually design the development to accommodate the outcomes, including vegetation, including trees, rather than being the afterthought, which will avoid much of the issue of inappropriate trees in inappropriate locations. The maintenance question is an interesting one. If our air conditioner breaks, we fix it. If our car breaks or needs a service, we service it. Trees are no different. We are property owners, they are our trees, they need at times maintenance and we're responsible for doing that. The types of trees that we're talking about as part of these developments, however, aren't the trees or the problematic trees that we have on our properties today. They're not the big gums that drop limbs. They're not the trees that cause, that have nuts and drop leaves. There are a whole series of appropriate trees that aren't intrusive, that provide an amount of shade, that add to the green canopy, that don't cause any problems and can be designed to not cause any problems.
I'm going to leave it at that. I know there's a massive concern right there, which is around if we're requiring this, there's a massive cost attached to this, and that's the key implication, that's the key concern here, is the cost associated with that. I'm going to move on because we've got a few questions to get through, but I think take note, and I think Councillor's taking note of the fact that there's a large cost associated with the maintenance of these trees, and there are concerns about the impact of these trees on properties as a result of putting them up and having the split between 2 stories and single stories and the likes. I'm just going to move on to question 9, which is from Alan Johns, and the theme here was around double crossovers and garage parking. This question received 109 votes, and he says that C125 goes too far and will not achieve the stated objectives of enhancing the character of our suburbs for the following reasons. 1, reducing site coverage from 60 to 50 or even 40% will result in less off-street parking being provided in double-house developments, so single garages versus double. Having cars parked all over both sides of our roads reduces safety and I believe has the largest negative impact on our street character. So what is wrong with 60% coverage if it helps get cars parked off roads? Second point is that the proposed amendment C125 indicates an increased use of double crossovers, which in my opinion has a negative impact on street. I like that Monash has predominantly single crossovers per house with double developments front and back rather than side by side. And the third point here, increasing the rear setback to 5 meters or 7 meters seems to also promote double crossover and side-by-side developments. A 2 to 3 meter setback would be more reasonable, and I think this is similar to the question that was asked before and has been addressed. The last point he makes is I think everyone understands we need to closely manage the increased housing density required to fit in the almost doubling in Melbourne's population over the next 35 years. Has Council considered keeping current planning rules but limiting development to 2 houses per traditional block in excess of 600 meters squared, thus a minimum of 300 meters squared per subdivided block? That was another point that was alluded to in a previous question. This will succeed in restricting excessive developments but allows reasonable double unit development to occur. Over to you, Sean.
Okay, thanks, Eyal. I might deal with that last part first and then get back to the car parking issue. So applying a simple density control like 1 to 300 won't achieve the objectives that either Plan Melbourne or the housing strategy is seeking to achieve. Simply doubling the number of houses in our residential streets isn't really going to help anybody. So it won't put people closer to services, it will actually put more cars in streets. So that's the general thrust of the housing strategy, is in accordance with Plan Melbourne, is to direct that growth and encourage it to go there while still allowing dual occupancy to occur. So as was mentioned earlier, there is none of the changes actually knock out a dual occupancy in any of the suburban land in Monash. Changes the way it'll look, it doesn't stop it happening. And even if we wanted to just not have any control over the design and say it's just a density of 1 to 300, the planning scheme and the state government would never let that happen. The thing with also saying that is that you don't have any guarantee that any car parking would be provided if you're just saying it's a house on a 300 square metre block. So going back to the car parking issue around the site coverage, there's no actual relationship between the amount of site coverage you have and no direct relationship and the number of car parking spaces you have. The number of car parking spaces required in a development is set by Res Code, and it's not something that council can change as part of in a residential area. So it's one parking space, and it doesn't say in a garage or on a driveway. It says one parking space to be provided for up to 2 bedrooms, and 2 parking spaces to be provided for 3 and over. Now, councils have an issue with those parking rates because the other day I saw a dual occupancy application which complied pretty much with everything else. It had 8 bedrooms in each dwelling, but was only required to provide 2 car parking spaces per dwelling. And to get the 8 bedrooms in, they decided to do a single garage with a tandem space, so a car parking space on the hard stand. And that complies with the Res Code requirements. So we have no ability to say it has to be in a garage or it has to be covered. And we're not proposing to change that situation. So council requires the car parking that we are required to require, and the amendment isn't changing it one way or the other. In terms of the crossovers, they are generally, in some areas of Monash, discouraged, but there's no prohibition on the scheme for double crossovers, and they do get approved. So that the examples that were prepared, there's a couple of double crossovers in there. The majority of them are single crossovers. And they're all, if you've looked beyond the example on the back of the brochure, which is a conceptual plan, and the actual schematics that were drawn up by MGS architects for each zone, they have taken the first drawings that are there are real applications that have been approved. So they're not something that we've just concocted. They're things that have been approved and are probably been in the process of being built. So those driveway access and car parking arrangements are real-world examples of those.
Yeah. Great, thank you very much. I'm going to move to the final question. This one is from Urvati Sri, and she asked a question about subdivision and growth. She lives in an area where 90% of the properties are already subdivided. How will this new policy support properties which are already interested in subdividing as well? Will there be any leeway with our properties or similar properties? Second point is, considering most of the houses in my area have been subdivided, how has Council come to the conclusion that we need a garden city? With current population growth, we need more houses in established suburbs to accommodate young families. The third point is, what is the community growth rate for the past 5 years? What is the expected growth rate? And finally, why are people choosing Monash City as the best place to live in? I moved here because of lovely people, greenery, good government schools, public transport, hospitals, and other amenities. I'm sure most will vote for that point. How many people supported this particular question? A few ones in the room? Great. Thank you. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Ayal. This is part of the challenge that we have. One question is, why a garden city? And then when you speak to the person, they tell you why you moved here, it's because of the greenery. How, when we receive comments about and feedback, it's why you can't take them as one vote is against, and you have to have regard to the relevance of the commentary that people are talking about and what they're actually trying to achieve. I've read all of the comments on the website, and there are differing views on a lot of these issues. There's no consistent view to say no. People have issues with parts, with components, with all, and sometimes the statements they make are actually counter to some of the arguments they put forward. We try our best in advising council about how we move forward to decipher what that might mean in terms of the highest and best planning that we can achieve. I think that this resident is talking about 90% of properties in their street rather than in their suburb. We don't have a suburb that has 90% of properties subdivided as yet, although that day may well still come, if that's what we desire. But in terms of leeway being shown, these changes won't restrict an ability to subdivide and develop. The opportunity is there, it will remain there. There might be site circumstances and neighbourhood circumstances that mean it's appropriate for council in circumstances such as this to exercise discretion beyond these controls and regulations if they're adopted. That is possible, that is there. Council, in assessing planning applications today, does move away from requirements from time to time where it might be appropriate. If you've been fortunate enough to come to one of our council meetings and hear the debate on planning applications, you'll often hear councillors quiz me about waiving a dispensation of visitor car parking. It's normally Councillor Ponticus who's here, and that is a requirement of the planning scheme. 5 dwellings or more provide 1 visitor's car space. 95% of applicants don't. We have the debate in the chamber all the time about why they don't, because it's not always appropriate for that to occur. That's how these regulations will work. If there's sufficient reason to do that, there's no reason why you can't deviate and vary from these requirements. In terms of the Garden City, it's an established Monash principle. It's been in the planning scheme for over 20 or 30 years, and something that the community generally still tells us that they aspire to. It means different things for different people, but it's still one of the core principles that we hold in our planning scheme and that we aspire to. Is it the same as it was 20 years ago? No, it's not. I'd suggest that through the level of development, we are far less green in terms of canopy today than we were 20 years ago. Do we want to be, in 20 years' time, that much further down the track in terms of the lack of green that we have? Will Amendment C125 arrest that issue?
Peter, have you
not.
Have you got any stats on the growth rates?
I do, and I'll get there. Sorry, I'm waffling on a bit, Al.
If you don't mind, we've got a few to get through here.
Yep, I'll get there. The other ones will be quicker. So it is an important challenge for us. In terms of the stats, and thanks for the prompt, we're getting about 0.6% of growth per year. We're getting about 530 new houses built, or additional houses, not new, additional, built in the municipality per annum. And I don't anticipate or expect that with Amendment C125 that will change. I think that particularly with some of the residential growth zones, we will see numbers perhaps being higher, but we certainly won't see a lesser ability to develop medium density housing in our residential hinterland. In terms of population numbers, there hasn't been a census, and I think the census is due next year, but we estimate that between 2010 and 2014, there's probably about 10,000 new residents that have come into the municipality, and that, if it is the pattern, can continue through the housing stock that we have.
And just on the subdivision, so if you want to subdivide in the same way to other properties similar to you, will you be able to do that?
Well, it really depends on what the other properties have done. There are some subdivisions that may have occurred, 30 and 40 years ago that we're not approving today under the current regulations. It's certainly where an area is developed and the sensitivity of development can be different. So there is an opportunity.
Will there be retrospective implications as a result of those properties that have already been developed that way?
It doesn't affect properties that are developed now.
Okay. All right, we're going to move on. We've wrapped up the top 10. I thought we'd call up, we've got a little bit of time, so I'm going to go through just two questions that were still in the top, that were just 11 and 12, and also had someone in the crowd someone nominated to present those. I'll do them both at the same time so we get that, and then we're going to open it to the floor to take some questions from the floor. So I was going to call Caroline Bayliss, who was nominated by Lisa Gleeson, and it's the other sheet with questions 11 and 12. If you wanted to come up, Caroline, that'd be great. I'll read the first question from Valerie Yule. It's about play, sport, and the Garden City. And she said, I feel there's a minority of people who are opposed to the proposed changes. I think they are wonderful. They preserve backyards and provide a chance for good Australian cricket and other sports in the next 20 years. Think of the statements from children coming indoors from playing sport in the backyard. I made 100 in backyard at Mons. That might be a misspelling there, but you cannot do this if you don't have a backyard. How will the proposed amendment make sure it retains the nature of protecting the backyard space while children can play? And Caroline, did you want to join us? She's asking Lisa Gleeson's question, which had 82 votes. And this one is about boundary maintenance, privacy, and daylight.
I'm not Lisa, but...
Over to the microphone again. So try again. Oh, I didn't cue the... There you go.
I'm not Lisa, but Lisa can't be here, so she's asked someone who supported her question to read it out. Regarding Garden City zones, the proposed amendments go some way to improving the local area by requiring canopy trees and slightly better setbacks. Existing single-storey, single-dwelling homes are being hemmed in on all sides by two-storey units close to all boundaries, cutting off daylight, privacy and the ability to maintain a decent garden due to constant overshadowing. How will Council ensure these proposals are not watered down any further?
Can we take any support from the crowd for those? So we've got a few. Quite a mixed crowd tonight. Who wants to take the two of those?
Yeah, Peter.
Thanks for those two questions. In terms of the backyard space where children can play, it's precisely what the amendment is proposing in terms of the open space requirement. I would suggest that people who can't conceptualise space, there are units being sold across the municipality every weekend. Go and have a look at a unit and have a look at what 35 square metres of open space looks like and form your own opinion about whether that is an adequate area for a family and children to play in. I won't try and convince you of that. I ask you to go and form your own opinion. What these regulations or the proposed C125 tries to do is pare back some of that distance between what was the humongous backyard of 150 and 200 square metres that the houses in the 60s have, and some still do, and the 35 square metres of open space that we have at the moment. Does it pare it back enough? Again, I'll let you decide that. In terms of how will Council ensure the proposals aren't watered down any further, that is, I suppose, one of the strengths of the planning scheme. When you deal with medium density housing and applications, neighbours abutting, adjacent and in the local area have the opportunity to object to view plans, to object to applications, to involve themselves in the planning permit process. So if someone is doing something inappropriate, whether it's tomorrow or whether it is after, and in the case that C125 is if that should be approved, then it's not only council, who assesses that and determines whether it's appropriate, but it's each and every person who has the opportunity to participate in that process.
And just on with the privacy and what role this has played in actually impacting daylight with regards to properties?
So it doesn't change the requirements. There are current requirements in terms of overshadowing, overlooking that exist in the planning scheme today. This doesn't propose to change those at all. But by virtue of having some greater setbacks, it may improve some of those situations in terms of walls close to or on boundaries that are being built today that might not be appropriate under these regulations.
Great. Just quickly, Kellen, did you have a follow-up question on that? Or
Yeah, well, actually, it goes...
Can we get a microphone again, or is that one out? Try again.
It goes to that very point about current objections, and if we actually look at the number of objections and opposition to this proposed planning amendment, I wonder how that stacks up to the number of complaints and objections to individual applications per annum that relate to inappropriate setbacks, overshadowing, loss of trees, loss of amenity. And I think that's something that we really need to consider. It's one thing to take into account a lot of people who are objecting to being able to do what they want with their individual block of land. But council, to your point, doesn't council have to take into account the bigger picture and the amount of, and dealing with the amount of complaints it's getting on these very issues about inappropriate development already?
Do we have stats on that? Support for that question?
Yeah. I don't have numbers at hand, but I can say that objections to planning or medium density housing applications are commonplace. Probably more often than not, you'll have objections to a medium density housing application. Part of the tension that is the planning system, and that is a challenge for all of you and all of us, is how much restriction we can accept on our own blocks has a direct impact upon how much restriction we want to exercise on our neighbours' allotments. It is that simple.
Great. Thank you so much for stepping in, Caroline. Really appreciate it. I'm now going to turn it over to the floor. I want to take some questions from the floor. Can I get any questions from the floor? I've got this woman here in the front. Do you want to... I'll just wait for their microphone to get to you right there. If you don't mind stating your name, and if you want to stand up, you can. If you want to sit, that's fine as well.
Janet Baker. I just want to raise an issue that has not been addressed at all by the new planning. Raising the issue of the major problem we have with single dwellings, the removal of all trees on the block, and then the single dwelling built with all kinds of issues of privacy. And I notice you've been focusing on the multi-density block, but there's been very little discussion of the adverse effect this is having on the amenities and the garden nature of the municipality. And I think it's a bit unrealistic to avoid, it's like the elephant in the room, and particularly the number of empty, huge mansions there are in Monash at the moment, which have been developed and then they're not occupied.
Thank you. So the adverse effect on single-storey homes,
Do you want me to do that?
and there's a bit of support in the crowd for that. Did you want to take that? And be brief, please.
I think AL's saying I'm speaking too much, but it is a great tension point. So as Sean mentioned before, the controls in terms of the siting requirements and setbacks do affect single dwellings. The requirements from a planning permit don't relate to a single dwelling. In terms of vegetation, there are parts of the municipality that have vegetation protection overlay, and that protects trees above 10 metres, and they require a planning permit for removal unless they're dead, dying or dangerous. If you don't have that control, you can remove the tree. This doesn't deal with that issue. Council is about to commence doing a vegetation study across the municipality, which will look at vegetation cover, and whether the controls we have are adequate both ways, whether they're not restrictive enough in some locations or whether they're too restrictive in some areas, and council will be considering that in the future.
I want to take, I'll take another one from this floor, and then I'll take one from the second floor as well. I'll just, actually, I'll go in the corner of the chap with the blue shirt right there. Yeah.
Thank you. Damien Quinn, resident of Monash. A designer for 38 years, now retired. My concern is with the increased size of the private open space to 60 square metres and the 5 metre setback will mean that just about in every case the private open space for the rear unit or dwelling will go right across the back of the block. Now, in terms of the solar aspect of all of that, it then means you don't have the ability to switch the private open space around. So a south-facing block of land at the back will be in shadow all the time. A west-facing block of land will get a blast of west afternoon sun. And an east-facing will be limited perhaps in terms of the amount of north-facing windows that they can achieve. So that if you keep it at 35 square metres, which I've planned on various projects and I felt was really quite adequate for most unit development, I often didn't just put the 5 metre minimum distance across the back of the block, but swung it around so that the 5 metres went down along the side, and often a lot longer than the 7 metres. So sunlight could penetrate through back into the back garden. The only other point I'd like to make is that everyone feels warm and fuzzy about the idea that I'm going to get 5 metres from the back fence from the neighbours, and then there's another 5 metres that I've got on my property. It's going to be wonderful for privacy. Well, I'd probably rather that the unit was built a little closer and therefore had to have screening on windows, particularly in the centre, that didn't look into my back garden. And this comes about because of the 9 metre res code overlooking rule, where you take a line from the first floor, 1.7 above floor level, and it depends on the floor heights and level blocks of land. But in general terms, on a level block of land with standard construction, you'll have to build the first floor back around 5.7 metres from the back fence. At 5.7 metres on a level block of land, you'll take a line straight out, it'll go down on, and you bring the sight line back in, and the 1.8 metre fence will in actual fact give you privacy, and you don't need any screening.
We'll just take that. Can we take that question there? Or?
Okay, so they're the 2 points really. It limits you in solar efficiency.
Yep.
But this 5.7 metre is going to be the norm. You're going to get windows looking
Limits
straight
solar
down
efficiency and the rear setback. Thank you. Do you want to take that one?
I'd love to change the overlooking provisions in the planning scheme. I can't. Have you got any suggestions for me to speak to the state government about it? I don't have the ability to vary those. Does that mean that overlooking or potential overlooking is worse than building bulk in a rear yard? I don't know. I think that I could speak to someone else and say having a wall on my rear boundary and a 2-storey 2 metres back from that at 9 metres is far worse than overlooking. I can put a trellis on my fence and build a plant or a creeper and block some of that overlooking if I choose to. What can I do about the house next door? Not much. In terms of your open space question, which is why we're at pains to say there might be circumstances where it's appropriate and logical to be able to vary from these requirements. We find that most people are putting the open space at the rear or rear and side. That this doesn't change the ability to do that.
This will force them into doing it because it's got to be so wide. That's the problem. Rather than being 7 metres wide, it's going to have to be 12 metres wide. Well, it's right across the back.
Well, it's a minimum 5 metre dimension. It doesn't have a minimum 7 anymore that's proposed. But what it does do is make people apply for variations in the context of good design, not just for the sake of doing it.
I think there's some powerful suggestions.
And the only other point I'd make is why not bring in a regulation that they can build to within a metre, or let's say 2 metres from the back fence, provided it's only 50% of the width of the actual block, or a particular dimension. That would then allow the solar design, and it means that you don't get this great big bit of it built in from the back.
So the worst kept secret of these changes is that today you can build a wall on a rear boundary. And if you're not on the rear boundary, you must be set back at least 1 metre. Under C125, you can build a wall on the rear boundary. And if you're not on the boundary, you must be set back 5 metres, is what it suggests. It doesn't change your ability to build on a rear boundary. It changes the setback requirement if you're not on that boundary. It provides that flexibility.
I'm going to take 2 questions from the top. I've got 2 questions at the top. I might take 2 in a row because we're almost out of time. And so if I can get the first person and then get ready for the second person after that. Do we have a camera and a microphone at the top? Great, there we go. First question.
Hi, I have a question with regards to the private open space. Just trying to understand.
Can you please hold the microphone a bit closer to your mouth?
Okay, is this better?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Just a question with regards to the private open space. With regards to the 75 square metres of minimum private open space that is required, just trying to understand that we also need a parcel of 60 square metres at the side of the rear. Now, if my front setback is, say, 8 metres and my block is 16 metres wide, that means that I already have 128 square metres of private open space on the block already, which is in excess of the 75. Now, I understand that we need secluded private open space, which currently is 35 square metres. But by providing another 60, say I'm being forced to provide a private open space of 128 plus 60. So you do the math. So I'm just trying to think whether are we trying to sneak in something here by stealth in terms of an added requirement, which will become, mandatory if this is adopted. The other thing I wanted to say was this. That in question number 10, there was a point number 5, which said that does council think that previous rules are misused? If so, explain where and what action council has taken. I don't think this was addressed earlier. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that up. That's great. So those 2 questions. Is it all right if I get another one? You able to handle that, Peter? We'll go for another question from the top because we're almost out of time. Can we get the next question asker lined up?
There's no other questions.
Another one at the top? Okay, we'll do those 2.
All right. So in terms of open space by stealth, there are no secrets here. Nothing's hidden. What's proposed is in black and white in the amendment. The front setback requirement is there. The 7.6 has been there for 15 or so years. That is the contribution to neighbourhood character and a consistency of setback. That front setback area is a front setback area. It's not private open space. There's no, I'd think that many people would be reluctant to put a washing line and have their kids running around in the front yard without being supervised. Secluded private open space is secluded private open space. It's a rear or side area. Amendment C125 says it proposes to go from 35 to 60. It's black and white.
Sorry, Peter, just on that. I'm not sure if I've misunderstood the question. It's not 75 plus 60. It's 75 square metres, and of that 75, 1 lump of 60. At the moment, it's 75 square metres. So the overall quantum doesn't change. The amount isn't changing. It's where it's provided. I think that's an important thing to convey, because there seems to be some confusion that people think we're biting 5 metres, we're biting the front setback, and we're asking for 75, and we're asking for 60. It's not. The amount is not changing. It's the design and how it's provided is.
So it's still about across the entire space rather than in one location.
It's still 75 square metres per dwelling.
It's still 75 metres per dwelling.
In terms of question 5,
do you just want to have a quick follow-up on that? Yep.
Sorry to jump in. You can't have 15 square metres of open space. So by default, the open space is going to be more than 75. Is what I'm trying to say.
It's per dwelling though. So the rear dwelling that doesn't have the benefit of the setback has a total of 75. It stands to reason that if you count total open space of front dwelling, unless it's a side-by-side development, we'll have more.
I appreciate that, but what I'm trying to say is that will there be some leeway be given in terms of being able to use part of the the front setback to be counted towards the secluded private open space by perhaps allowing a 1.5 metre fence 3 metres away from the property boundary at the street frontage?
It's high fencing and so high fencing causes a whole different issue that would spend time on, but in Monash we traditionally have lower fencing. The planning scheme talks about a 1.2 metre and you need a dispensation from council or approval from council. The real issue that high fencing causes is in most of our suburbs and neighbourhoods and streets it's not characteristic. So we're introducing an element that we're not getting open front yards and seeing houses but seeing high fences. The other issue of having a fence that's set further back is experience tells us, and we've seen, that the area in front of the fence is rarely maintained and kept in a very good state, and it's often forgotten. So in terms of secluded private open space, the principles that we follow today in terms of being to a side or rear are the principles that would continue to apply under C125 should it be adopted.
And my apologies. I'm just going to move to the next question because we do have to get through a few more. But does council think that previous rules are misused? If so, explain where and what action council has taken. My apologies for missing that as the final piece of the 10th question.
Ayal, I wouldn't say misused. I think they allow a level of development that is changing. The types of single houses and medium density housing applications that we're seeing today are far larger and perhaps more imposing than even they were 10 years ago. So the expectations have changed. The regulations haven't kept pace with those, and they do allow a very generous and large amount of development. In terms of what we've done, Amendment C125 is what we're trying to do and what we're speaking to the community about, whether that represents a change that we should see occur or not.
I'm going to take another question from the top. Yep.
My question is a little bit specific to a parcel of land that I've just purchased in Mount Waverley. So it's been rezoned to Neighbourhood Residential Zone 2. It abuts Tunnel Reserve. The main couple of concerns I have are with site permeability. As far as I'm aware, the site coverage has been reduced from 60% to 40%, which seems like a lot. But I understand that with regard to preserving the natural area there, that's understandable. But and you have alluded to the fact that that's something for a builder to sort of work around. But just as a contrast, my neighbour, who built a couple of townhouses pretty recently, actually has walls on my fence back as far as the reserve itself. And from what I can gather, quite very little permeability at all. And I just wanted to highlight sort of the contrast and inconsistency there. I understand this is retrospective, but I just wanted to make a point of that. And also, given that my site is sloping, I had a query about height restrictions. Is the height restriction on a sloping block still 10 metres, or is there a limit to the number of stories that can be built on a block?
Thanks for the question.
In a residential zone.
Is that over to you,
Okay,
Simon?
yeah, I'll take that one. Thanks, Al. Sorry, you said you backed onto a reserve?
Sorry,
I think.
it's
So you're in a
tunnel-
neighbourhood
tunnel
residential
reserve.
zone.
On a tunnel, back at the
Yeah.
tunnel. Yep.
So you are correct. There's a proposed reduction. So the amendment hasn't come in, as we've been at pains to point out. But I guess what's on your neighbouring property is part of the reason council's proposing some of these changes, particularly in those areas. It sounds like you're not that happy about that length of wall on your boundary and the level of site coverage that's there.
Sorry to interrupt you, but basically we've purchased that as an investment in the future at quite a great expense. My wife and I, we've just had our first child, and we've purposely picked that area for the decent schools in the area, paid quite a premium for it, and these restrictions have obviously come in post that purchase. So yeah, my main concern is the restrictions that have come in have disadvantaged us as to what we can build a family home, or the type of family home we can build. That's my main concern, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay, so again, these changes haven't come in as yet. There's a while to go in terms of the more consultation, council forming an in-principle position on what it wants to do. There'll be opportunity for panel hearings if the amendment goes down the track. And if you're talking about a single dwelling on a block of that nature, going back to what we said earlier about the standards being discretionary, so we expect that in most instances people will meet those standards. But there is discretion in there in the case of a single dwelling to obtain what's called a report and consent, which gives a variation to some of those things like site coverage or side setback, rear setback, in the context of what the neighbourhood is. So I think one of the earlier questions from Jacinta and Sirith was around, this is what's happened in my neighbourhood, and it's clearly different from what you're seeking to achieve. Council has, and the council's building surveyors in those instances have discretion to vary some of those standards. So whilst you might not be able to do exactly what the block next door did under the current provisions of 80% paved and built on and 60% site coverage, there's wriggle room in the middle for you to get an outcome that sort of meets your needs and still makes a contribution to that character of the area. But it certainly wouldn't be at the extreme end of that 60% site coverage plan we put up earlier in the evening.
Thank you, Sean. I'm going to bring this to a close, but before I do, I just wanted to let everyone know that there are forms on your seats that actually enable you to submit emails and submit further submissions to council if you have follow-up questions about specific property issues. There's also a phone number on there as well. Also, if you can fill in the registration forms and give it to people who have a name tag from the staff so we can provide you with any follow-up information from tonight, including the video and the mix of it. If you have specific questions about your property, and not questions about planning applications necessarily, but ones that are related to the changes that are being made, we've got planners that are set up at a couple of tables in the room. A couple set will be here at this table on this floor, and there's also ones on the second floor as well that will be set up in a few different locations where you can ask your specific questions. I want to thank you for all the question askers who put their questions in, and for all those who voted, commented, and viewed questions in the lead up to this night. Also those who asked questions here tonight. Thank you to our planners, to Peter and Sean, who provided the responses tonight. And thank you all for coming. If you do have any follow-ups, please turn to your planners. We also want to thank Council for joining us tonight and sticking through to hear the different questions and concerns. And as mentioned, there are a couple of weeks before the preliminary decision will be made. And so feel free to get in touch with Council to refine your understanding and also to make suggestions about the proposed amendment. Thanks so much. Have a good night.